I would say we have a guest who needs no introduction, but we're going to give him one anyway. We are chatting with the founder and creator of School of Podcasting, which began all the way back in 2005. He's also the head of podcasting at PodPage, formerly of Libsyn. He's a good friend to most podcasters, including myself. He is the wonderful, amazing Dave Jackson. Dave, thank you for joining us today.
Matthew, it's always great to hang out with you. It's always a good time, and looking forward to this.
I usually ask everybody, how did you get into podcasting? But I have a feeling that story has been told 6 gajillion times by you on various podcasts, including the 3 gajillion that you have started on your own. So instead, real quickly, I just want to kind of like take me through, not when you started to podcast, but really when you started to work in podcasts and really become part of the industry, and what that was like for you as someone who, just kind of jumped into the space on a whim.
Yeah, it's kind of weird in a way. I remember the very first event. It was in, I believe, 2006 in Ontario, California, the metropolis of Ontario, California, which I never had heard of. And we're in a Holiday Inn, and it was weird because all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm not the only nerdy guy playing with this stuff. And so you start to make connections. Like that's where I met Todd Cochran and a bunch of other people. And it wasn't until really when I got involved, like the industry, because I was doing the School of Podcasting, and that's where it was fun. I had Rob Walsh on the show. I had Todd Cochran. I was kind of like Switzerland. I could work with all the different media hosts. And when I lost my teaching job, I was like, well, I'd like to work in podcasting. And I was like, well, where would I work? And I'm like, well, Libsyn's the best. So let's go there, and called up Rob and had a quick conversation. And so that's kind of where it began. Just when I originally, when I got laid off at my teaching job, I called my then wife and I said, hey, I think I'm going to do the School of Podcasting full time. And she went, yeah, no, you're not. And I went, what? And she's like, yeah, no, sorry, thanks. And I'm like, but honey, you're a nurse. You make tons of cash and you have great health benefits. But and so that's kind of how I got into Libsyn. And it's just a matter of I'm curious. So I'm always talking to people about new tools and different strategies that they're doing. And so I think it was just a matter of like podcasting is the bubble that I live in. And so there are other people that are, there's a whole true crime thing that I know it's huge, but there's like little mini celebrities in there. And then, every little genre has their own little bubble. I remember when I went to, I think it was called VidCon in Seattle, and I'd never seen cosplay. And if nobody tells you what cosplay is, and you walk in and you're like, why does that guy have elf ears on? And it was Welcome to Nightville. All these people were dressed like characters in Welcome to Nightville. And then when I went into the big room, and it looks like a Metallica concert with 2 big giant screens, and the whole room is filled, and everybody was laughing at jokes that I had no idea what they were. They were all inside jokes. And if you listen to that podcast, you got them. I was sitting there scratching my head while people are rolling out of their seats like it's showtime at the Apollo. And that's when I went, wow, this is a whole other bubble that I've known nothing about. So it's kind of interesting how you get immersed into what you think is the industry, and instead it's just a little small, chunk of it.
It's so true. Even going to events, Podcast Movement, PodFest, right? You tend to see the same people, a lot of the same personalities, a lot of the same companies. And then you go to an event or you talk to somebody online, you bring up all these people like, oh yeah, you're being a podcasting, so this, and they're like, nope. And they've got a whole other world of people in podcasting who they think are the bee's knees, who they think are the leaders or the influencers and whatnot. So it is interesting how large this world is and yet how small it can feel for each of those different communities. I'm curious, moving from teaching and podcasting on your own and School of Podcasting to, getting behind an industry player and, seeing not just how the sausage is made, but how everybody complains about how the sausage is made. Was there anything that like jaded you on podcasting, or was there anything that happened that, made you change the way you approach your content, your stuff?
The only thing that really just makes me go, oh, it's one of those, is the person that more or less, now they don't say it this blatantly, but they come up to me and they basically say, what's the topic I can talk about where I can do the least amount of work and make the most amount of money? Which I understand. Who wants to do a lot of work to make, but the person that's really looking for the shortcut and doesn't even care what the topic is. And I'm like, wait, so you have no passion about a topic. You're just going to pick the one that makes the most money. And I'm just kind of, that always makes me just kind of, there's like a sad trombone going off in my head when that person asks the question. Um, it's just, in terms of, things, ways people move. The thing I like about podcasting is there are no rules. There are definitely best practices. So when I have a guy right now that is working, I'm not going to tell you the exact name, but he's basing a show on his last name, and he's going to interview other people with the same last name and talk about famous people with the same last name. And he asked me, "Do you think this is going to work?" And I go, "I got to tell you, you get like A+ for originality, because I've never heard anybody else do that." I go, "Now, is this going to work?" I go, "In theory, if somebody with that last name and they know their family, who I'm assuming have the same last name," I go, "it could work." I go, "But this is one of those recipes that, like, the only way to know if it's going to work is to make it and then see what happens." It's like I've never had chocolate with my peanut butter before. Let's try this, and it may work, it may not. So I love to see people being really creative, especially when you go, this could fall flat, and yet they do it anyway.
Yeah, an idea like that, it sounds interesting, right? Terrible on paper, but interesting. And with the right host and with the right commitment, it probably could turn into a weird cultural phenomenon, right? That people are talking about. But it's not a guarantee that just because you're niche or weird, it's going to work. But you know, those types of shows are the ones that tend to break through, the ones that break the mold, that disrupt the space. Um, and so, yeah, when somebody says, "What should I podcast about?" It's like, no, no, no. What am I passionate about? How do I share it? Maybe a podcast is right for you.
Yeah. I just
Is
saw Sean Evans, who does Hot Ones on YouTube, was on Jimmy Kimmel. And I'm like, that's a pretty niche show. I'm going to interview people while they're basically, you know,
torturing
throwing,
themselves.
yeah, torturing themselves with hot wings. And then I'm going to be a really good interviewer and ask questions that require them to think. That's a pretty strange premise.
It is. And yet how many copycats have come up as a result,
Yeah.
right? Because it worked for one person.
Yeah.
So you worked for Libsyn for a really long time. You've moved on over to PodPage. A great company. We had Brendan on the show, one of the first episodes. Always been a big supporter of PodPage. We use that for this show. But you guys are unveiling new features, including one that just came out at the time that we're chatting, maybe about a week or so ago. Surveys for your audience. Tell us what that's about. How it's supposed to work on PodPage, and why this one got introduced.
Yeah. There are, multiple ways you can kind of see. And that's the point. I can kind of see how people like my stuff by going to, podcastconnect.apple.com and looking at my completion rate. I can see some of that in Spotify. If you're on YouTube, you can see that on YouTube. But, the easiest way to figure out if your audience likes what you're putting out is to, I don't know, ask them. And so what we did is Tom Webster, Hall of Fame person, Tom Webster, right, inductee, has a great book called The Audience is Listening. And Tom's been measuring podcasting and before that radio for decades. And he had these really good, instead of saying, is it too short or too long? Ask a question like, if I were to remove something from the podcast, what would it be? That's kind of asking if it's too long. There's these little subtle ways of doing it. And so we reached out to Tom and said, wow, you have these really great questions. Can we use them to make a survey in PodPage? To which Tom said, yeah, as long as you put a link to my book at the top of the description of the survey, not so much for the public, but for the podcaster. And we're like, done. And then we added 5 questions in the event that you want to ask something that Tom doesn't. And it's been, the people that are using it are getting this great data where one of our customers was doing a daily show, and he said the number one thing I'm hearing from my audience is they don't need a daily show. They're kind of getting fed with a fire hose. He's giving them great topics to think about, and they're like, can I have a little more time to think about this topic before you hit me with another one? And like I found out, I primarily hang out on Facebook and in Twitter. And I asked my audience, and a considerably large amount of people hang out on LinkedIn. And I kind of play in LinkedIn, but I was like, well, guess what? That's where my audience is. Maybe I should go hang out there more. So the more you know about your audience, the better you can make your stuff. And so I always say, if your podcast is, a dinner party, and then you find out, oh, wait a minute, Jill's coming over and she's vegan, and Rob's coming over and he's gluten intolerant or whatever, you're gonna have to change your meal up a little bit. Or in some cases you go, well, gluten-free people, sorry, you're just not my target audience, depending on whatever it is. But the more you know about your audience, and especially what they want, the more you can give it to them. Then the more you give it to them, the more likely they are to tell somebody to go listen to your show.
Interesting you bring up that concept of the vegan and the gluten-free, and you start to allude to, well, maybe you're just not my audience, I shouldn't cater to it. But it's so hard for new podcasters to be told to limit your audience, right? Everybody wants the biggest audience possible, but if they try to attract everyone, they're going to attract no one. How do you talk to clients or other podcasters and tell them, fight that urge to cater to a larger audience and focus on just your target audience, right? It's okay to reject outside ideas, even if you're, sitting at only a few downloads per episode.
Yeah, because part of that is based on, we want huge numbers. And if we limit our audience, well, that doesn't seem to make any sense. And look, I'm guilty of this as well, because, and I always, at the beginning of it, if I'm doing a show for an absolute beginner, I will say at the beginning of the show, this is for an absolute beginner, because a lot of my audience has been podcasting. They're like, hey, I want to grow this. I don't want to launch it. So I always do that. But there's a part of me that goes, you should split this off and just do a show about launching, instead of occasionally giving people an episode that they may not want. But I always try to say that, if you've already launched, you might want to listen to this, because I know a lot of people don't think about, how am I going to measure my success? And so it is kind of tough, but it's a matter of not, it's about getting the right people, not a ton of people. Because I mean, I was just at PodFest, and I'm in a room full of podcasters, and we all have the same ideas, and that we're all trying to grow our audience, and we're sharing insights and things like that. And when you have that community, and you don't have to worry about leaving somebody out because you're all on the same page, that's a magical thing. And you don't want to be just a good podcast. You want to be someone's favorite. And I always use the analogy of taking people out for pizza. I had an aunt in from out of town, so we had about a group of 12, and we went into this place, and my aunt and my niece are kitchen sink pizza, right? Just whatever you got back there, throw it on there. We'll just anchovies, whatever. And they were happy as pigs in mud, because they got their favorite type of pizza. My brother looks at me and goes, hey, what do you want? I go, I usually do pepperoni. He goes, can you do extra cheese? And I go, yeah, okay. So I didn't get my absolute favorite pizza. It was good. It was great, but it wasn't like, oh, this is the best pizza ever. And so our goal is to be someone, like, the minute this comes out, they're like, oh man, there's another episode for Matthew. I got to go play this. And if you kind of give them what they want, that's probably not the result you're going to get. And it's hard. It really is. It's tough to, not every chapter gets highlighted. And so you do your best, and it starts with knowing who your audience is, and you aim and you fire. And it's always funny. I'm sure you've had this, where you've worked on an episode forever. You put it out thinking it's the best thing and it's going to go viral or whatever, and it's just crickets. And then there are episodes. I had one that I put out while I was at PodFest, and it was kind of like, yeah, this is on point. It's not my best stuff, but I got home and people were like, that was a great episode. And I'm like, really? So, but it all starts with knowing, who your audience is. And that's where, it all starts. And it's hard to talk people off I want, it's, how far are we into this? 7 minutes. I'm going to say the Rogan word, right? When we hear Joe Rogan in this giant audience, and I always just tell people, realize step one of that is be Joe Rogan. And I did this in my presentation. I said, how many people in the room are Joe Rogan? And of course, nobody raised their hand. I'm like, good. So let's drop that strategy, because we're just not going to do it. But it is tough. And it's also, this is where you mentioned passion earlier. If you do kind of put up a little bit of guardrails to stay on topic, there are times after a year and a half where you're like, I can't talk about this anymore. And so you are allowed to expand out. I remember Lee Silverstein had a show called the Colon Cancer Podcast. And after years, he finally rebranded the title, and it was We Have Cancer, because when somebody in your family has cancer, everybody basically is going through that together. But it is tough to stay on track. But if you have that focus, then you're going to end up, we're going from a shotgun approach to trying to be everything to everyone to a rifle, which I hate that it's such a violent example, but you're more spot on.
These were Nerf rifles, and Nerf
Right,
shotguns,
exactly.
so they're very, very gentle and very, very safe. So going back to the survey, podcasters are always told, talk to your audience, ask them what they want, right? Check with them. And, PodPage has this feature. It's supposed to make it a little bit easier as my camera sits here and plays all sorts of funny games with me. Sorry, audience. But sometimes people put that stuff out there and they get crickets. How would you advise someone to get their audience to respond, to engage, to interact with them? Because otherwise they're going to feel even lonelier and frustrated, right, and probably want to give up.
Yeah, this is, if we go back to the old Rush song, if you choose not to decide, you've still made a choice. So if you're trying to get feedback and you don't get any, you've actually just got a ton of feedback. It's not very good feedback, but your audience is letting you know, I'm not really feeling connected to you. And so everybody likes to benefit. And so you kind of, if I got 0 responses, I might come back and say, hey, 2 weeks ago, I asked you to fill out a survey and I've got a whole lot of nothing. And so I just want to remind you that the reason I'm doing this survey is I'm doing this show for you. I mean, I love this topic, but I'm doing this show for you. And the more I know what you're looking for, the more I can go find that content and bring it to you. And then it won't just be me and you, because I always talk to one person. It won't be just me and you sitting here talking about this topic. We can have a whole community of people. My goal is to grow this and have a community, maybe a Facebook group or a heartbeat group where we can all talk about this. But it's going to start with making sure that I know what you want. So I would really deeply appreciate it if you could just simply go to mywebsite.com, whatever that is, /survey, and fill this out. And I'll be, if you want to put your name in, I'll even give you a shout out, whatever it is. But everybody likes to benefit. And so it's like when people do this with emails, they'll be like, oh, just go sign up for my you can sign up for the newsletter. Okay, for what? Because I didn't wake up today going, ooh, I hope I can find a newsletter to sign up for.
Please fill my inbox with more stuff.
Yes. So you've got to give something to them. And so, there's not, now the survey at PodPage, you can give them a, PDF or something like that. You can give them a little incentive to do it. But if the incentive is, hey, this show is going to be better based on your feedback. So it's just one of those things, but it's one of those things, it is soul crushing when you put it out there and there's just crickets and you're like, well, that's my worst nightmare come to life. And that's when you're just like, well, at least I know where I'm starting at and I can only go up from here.
I love the way you frame that, and, I always talked about this with my clients in the past. And even today, when I talk to podcasters about their marketing efforts, it's not about what the audience can do for me. It's about what you can do for the audience. What value are you providing them? And so the way you frame that, I think was great. And, I think if everybody approached all of their content creation in that same way with, here's what I'm giving you, if you happen to listen, here's what I'm giving you, if you subscribe, you'll definitely see better results, in the long run. If you're giving them something that they want, if you're giving them crap, right?
Yeah.
Nobody needs crap.
Well, and you're kind of coming up alongside them instead of you being the leader. You're kind of coming alongside of them, like, hey guys, let's go ahead and come up with the best content. We're going to grow this community together. I just happen to be the person behind the microphone, and so it's tricky. And this is where we mentioned the survey. This is one of the things I do when I go to an event like Podfest or Podcast Movement. A lot of me is just listening. to seeing what people are talking about and what they're getting stuck on and things like that. And so that's where, if you're not getting any engagement, head out to a Facebook group or Reddit or wherever you're going, and you can actually see what people are stuck on. And, that's really kind of the bottom line of what people want is, I have a problem. How can I solve it? Or it's, you might be talking, I see not a lot, but there are podcasts about rare diseases. And those people, you're not going to get a ton. You're not going to get thousands and thousands, depending, I guess, on the disease. But when somebody else, I know there's one, it's something spondylitis. And the group themselves call it Spondy, is like a nickname. And the fact and it's a horrible disease. You're in pain all the time. And so Jason Sacco does a show on spondylitis, whatever the beginning of that is. And he was talking about how just having somebody else that's going through the same crap you are is a huge benefit because you don't feel alone. And so when you can go out and see what people are talking about and then talk about it on the show, that's one of those, on paper, this should resonate.
Yeah, I remember when I was hosting Call Spots, talking to a lot of people who were doing shows about very rare diseases or very niche causes, and more than being informational, it was community. It was right, just having somebody else who understands what you're going through talking about it, and 20 or 30 listeners doesn't sound like a lot to most of us, but in a group like this, rare disease group where they are all fighting the same thing, the 20 or 30 of them able to get together, pool their resources, write to different agencies and whatnot to get more funding or go out, like, it made a difference. And that was all possible because, one person who was going through this decided to open up the microphone and share some value with people. We can talk to Dave Jackson for probably days in a row, probably some amazing World Guinness Marathon on podcasting. But if you've heard him before, he's not quite that 100% that we love to get from him, so we're not going to keep him for too long. But as a reminder, it's Dave Jackson from the famous School of Podcasting, head of podcasting at PodPage, which we encourage you to check out both of those properties. Before we let you go, Dave, there are questions we like to ask everybody. First one is, if there's something in podcasting that you would like to see improved, what would it be? And that can be, production, distribution, consumption, right? Like, doesn't have to be from the creating a podcast, just something that you're like, God, I wish we did this better.
Well, I've been someone involved, at least paying attention to the podcasting 2.0 space. And that was not that it doesn't have momentum now, but I feel, in my opinion, that we lost a little bit because there was this whole streaming Bitcoin thing, and it was getting easier and easier, still far from being easy, but it was getting there. And we tried to do things decentralized. We ended up, unfortunately, centralized on a company, and nothing against this company, but the problem is, if you have a lot of Bitcoin going back and forth, you can kind of get the attention of the government because they're like, wait, are you laundering money over there? And so that company was like, yeah, we will help anybody unless you're in the US. And so that's kind of taken a seat back. And I feel like the one girl in Willy Wonka that's like, I want it now, daddy, and they are working on a different approach. But that's one that I'm kind of like, oh, we were really getting some steam going there. So there's that. And I mentioned it earlier. I think the other thing that we just kind of need is a little more creativity. I don't, and it's just, old curmudgeon of me. In the early days, there were some really weird shows. I remember one guy, as he was, shall we say, doing his business in the first of the morning, it was called the Daily Download. And he was on his throne, shall we say, recording a podcast. Very weird. There was a show called Yeast Radio, hosted by Madge Weinstein, and Madge Weinstein had this wicked New Jersey accent, and back in the day, this is again like 2005, just swore like a sailor, like nobody's business, like really outrageous. And you're like, whoa, you could not do that on the radio. And then I found out later that Madge was a dude and it was an actor. The whole thing was just an act, and it was hilarious at the time. So there are times when, and there's nothing wrong with the typical solo show and an interview show and things like that. But I kind of like, can we kind of mix it up, throw something in there so that you can't be copied? I just inducted George Hrab into the Hall of Fame, and the one thing you can't do is copy George Hrab. There's only one of him, and he's so sometimes I'm like, I'd like to see a little more creativity and being different, and that's hard. I mean, that's one of the hardest things about podcasting. When you go, well, how is your show going to be different than everybody else's? And people go, and it is. It's your background and your thoughts and your perspectives that are going to make it different. But sometimes I miss the really super creative stuff.
Well, I suppose today it's a lot harder for that super creative stuff to break through with the deluge of new shows that are constantly coming out, with the barriers to entry being lowered even more so. So, but yeah, be creative, be fun, and be determined. Don't give up. We could use your good shows. What about tech? Is there anything on your wish list, hardware, software, something that is out there that you want to buy that you haven't yet, or something that you're like, God, I wish somebody would make this?
Yes, I love the PodTrack P4. Okay, it is the Swiss Army knife, and it came out years ago. It's about $150 now. And if we went back to 2010, this would have been a couple $1,000 or maybe $1,000. But anyway, I actually emailed Zoom this week, and I'm like, any chance a 32-bit float version of this is coming in the future? And they didn't say no, but they didn't say yes. But they do have the new H1 XLR.
Or the H6 Essential does 32-bit float with all the same features as the P4.
So it does, because the thing that's nice about the P4 is it's a recorder and an interface at the same time.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's beautiful, because I saw where the H1 is 2 microphones in, only 1 headphone out, that's kind of like womp womp, but if you're a solo person, it works. But I heard it does record and be an interface at the same time. So if the H6 does that, I might have to check into that. But I love my P4. Go ahead.
Yeah, the H6 does that. Obviously, it's not going to be $150.
Right.
And you also are stuck with just the one headphone jack.
Yeah. So you just buy a quick, headphone jack, headphone amplifier, and you're good.
Oh, don't worry. Zoom makes one that they'll happily sell you.
Yes, exactly. So that's the piece of gear. And look, that doesn't mean that the P4 is bad. It just everything, and the big magic phrase is 32-bit float, because it's kind of hard to record bad audio with that. And I'm like, oh, if we could only marry 32-bit float into a P4, life would be so fulfilling. So.
Well, if anybody wants to buy Dave a cup of coffee, aka a Zoom H6 Essential, I'm sure he would be grateful for it. And of course, this is going to be the hardest question because of what you do and how long you've been doing it. But are there any podcasts in your life that you cannot live without? The shows that, regardless of what else you're listening to, they drop a new episode, you're going to stop, or you're never going to let one of their episodes get by you that week?
There are probably 2. One is, I mentioned him earlier, George Hrab does a show called the Geologic Podcast, and it is the epitome of, I don't know what I'm going to get. So as much as you should be consistent with your content, George is consistently funny, but it's the basis of that show is science. It's a lot of sciencey kind of animals that morph into this or do this and that. And he also has a segment called the Religious Moron of the Week, because George is a skeptic or atheist. Take your pick on whatever verbiage you want to use there. So I always joke and say, well, I listen to make sure I'm not the religious moron of the week, because I'm not a skeptic, but it's just entertaining. And it's one of those, I wonder, because I've been listening to George since 2006, maybe 2005. And I always wonder, if I hadn't been listening this long and found him today, if I would still feel that way. But I definitely feel like I know him. And then the other one is No Agenda with Adam Curry and John C. Dvorak, just because I keep hearing news that should be on the news, but it's not. And their whole part is they just kind of pick apart the news. Like you'll hear like, well, bird flu is up 2% and like, okay, but what numbers is that? Like if I went from, 2 people to 4 people, that's a, whatever percent. Never do math live, by the way. But they'll say, well, wait a minute, they're not giving us the numbers. They're giving us the percentage, and they just kind of dig through stuff. Plus, they have clips of news articles from forever. And so when somebody will say, well, we're going to do this new thing, and they'll be like, wait a minute, didn't he say the direct opposite like 8 months ago? And they'll be like, yep, here's the clip. So it's kind of fun. They deconstruct it, the media, and sometimes it stops you from, if you just watch the news, they just want you afraid and scared 24/7. You know, do you swallow saliva over a long period of time? You know, story at 11, this kind of thing. We're like, wait, what? So those are probably two off the top of my head that, there are others, new media show. I listen to your show. I listen to like so many shows about podcasting, but I think maybe that's why I like those shows, because they're not about podcasting. It's like, oh, here's a break and it's entertaining.
Yeah, I'm the same way. My two shows that I won't let go by. I listen to Start Here, the ABC Daily News podcast, and these days it's been Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend. I just find myself loving the interaction and needing a laugh, and they tend to provide a good one every time I listen. Um, so yeah, I'm terrible about listening to podcasts about podcasting.
Yeah. Well, and Conan's a good interviewer. Once he gets to the interview, drives me nuts. I'm not like you, because you know them, you're probably listening for the witty banter at the beginning where he just makes fun of his staff. And I'm like, but he's interviewing Paul McCartney, get to, or whoever.
It's funny. I will listen to the witty banter and skip the interview sometimes.
Yeah.
If I have no idea who the person is.
Yeah. I'm the same way with Mark Maron. I used to listen for the interviews, and now I listen for the witty banter, except his witty banter is, we're all going to die. And I'm kind of not listening to that. He really is like worried that the world is coming to an end. And I'm like, this is not really what I was looking for.
Yeah, it could be exhausting.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's been a pleasure as always chatting with Dave Jackson from the infamous School of Podcasting. If you are thinking about starting a show or need help with yours, you will not find a kinder, gentler, more experienced person in the space to help you out with. And of course, head of podcasting at PodPage, which we already include a link to PodPage in our show notes every week, because that's what we use for our website. Can't say enough good things about that platform and the team over there. New features coming around all the time now. It seems like I feel like every few weeks I'm seeing you guys pop up something new. So just a great platform to use. Dave Jackson, always good to see you. Always good to hear from you. Always good to chat with you. Thanks for coming on.
Matthew, always great to hang out with you, man. Thank you so much.